Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on nickel depletion and enrichment in olivine in mafic hosted nickel copper sulfide systems. We're going to be asking a question that's been asked for several decades. Can we use olivine chemistry as a way of distinguishing ore hosting intrusions from barren ones? And my various co-authors here have been assembling a database to do that. It's now online in American Mineralogist, and the link to the full paper will be at the end of this talk. But let's just jump straight in. So the basic premise is very simple. Nickel that is equilibrated with silicate melt and sulfide liquid should have a lower nickel content than olivine that's seen only silicate melt in this type of very sort of simple conceptual kind of model for how these types of deposits form. But for that to work, we actually need to know what nickel undepleted olivine looks like in unmineralized systems. So we need to establish a reliable background for what barren systems should look like. And it turns out that actually it's a little bit more complicated than we thought. And we actually need two different baselines, depending on what kind of tectonic setting we're looking at, either continental large igneous provinces or conversion margins and archetype settings. So let's start out with large igneous province settings. And this is the plot you'll be seeing right through this talk: nickel in olivine against the four-stripe content of the olivine, and the most primitive compositions up in the top right-hand corner. As we know, as liquids fractionate and crystallize olivine, the olivine becomes less phosphoritic, more iron-rich, and typically less nickel-rich. And you can see our sort of predicted fields in that purple area there. These are model sulfide-free mantle melts. But the field we're interested in is that data cloud there, that color contour data cloud. That's for barren intrusions from large igneous provinces. And interestingly, if we compare that to the field for volcanic olivines from continental large igneous provinces, they're actually a bit different. They have a wider spread, and they tend to go towards higher nickel contents for reasons that we'll get into as we go along. So now if we look at orogenic belts, what we find is there's actually a different baseline. Barren intrusions in orogenic belts actually have lower nickel contents for the four-stripe content than olivines in large igneous provinces. And again, there are many reasons behind that. We don't need to go into them. All we need to know for the purposes of this exercise is what the baseline is, and it's that color contoured field. So now, for the next bit of the talk, I'm just going to be talking about orogenic settings, just for the sake of limited time. So here's a bunch of data from various mineralized intrusions. Red means hosting significant massive sulfide deposits or large disseminated deposits, and green are smaller or more disseminated sulfides. And I'll highlight a few examples. Here's the Sharihamu intrusion in Tibet, a very large tonnage disseminated sulfide deposit. And what we see in Sharihamu, as in several other of these kinds of deposits, is a very wide range of nickel contents for a limited range in this four-stripe content. It's a fairly sort of standard kind of pattern. We can look at some more of these examples. Here's the Rana intrusion and the Bejar intrusion. These are two small intrusions from orogenic belts. And both of these show very significant but very clear signals of nickel depleted olivines falling well below the baseline or within the lower part of it. Now, in both cases, these intrusions are associated with low nickel tin sulfides. So they're associated with systems formed at high R factors, where there's lots of sulfide, lots of competition for nickel between sulfide and olivine. So not surprisingly, the olivines are nickel depleted. But here's a bit of a surprise. Here's Kalatonka in the Central Asian orogenic belt in China, which in common with quite a few other intrusions, as we'll see, actually has a distinct signal of nickel enrichment, or at least certainly a lack of depletion. And olivine compositions, olivine nickel contents are sit up towards the top of the baseline range or above it. So takeaway here, mineralized bodies show a wide range of nickel forbidden four-stripe, deposits or intrusions that show very strong nickel depletion signatures, characteristically have very low tenor sulfides. And some intrusions, Kalatonka being an example, has a component of nickel enriched olivine compared with the baseline and compared with model compositions. So now let's have a look at Proterozoic orogenic belts. Those were all Phanerozoic belts we saw in that last slide. And I'm just going to focus on two particularly interesting ones here. This is the Savannah system in Western Australia. This is the Nova system in Western Australia. And in both of these cases, we have, again, strong signal, quite a highly variable nickel contents, big spread, big wide field, but also a significant component of not only relatively depleted olivines, but also relatively enriched ones. some of the Savannah in particular having nickel content well above the baseline for this tectonic setting. So what does this mean? Well, let's, before we go into interpretation, let's have a look at one other example, and a really interesting one, in which it shows a very wide spread of nickel in olivine, and also a very wide spread of nickel tenors in sulfide. This is the Kevitsa intrusion in Finland, which has a mix of ore types. The grey field here shows olivines from so-called false ore. This is disseminated sulfides with very, very low nickel tenors. Is also associated with very strong nickel-depleted olivines. The main part of the ore body here has fairly typical nickel tenors and sits generally at slightly higher nickel contents. But the interesting thing at Kevitsa are these red points here. These are from the so-called nickel PGE ores. These are very, very high nickel tenors, up to 30%, and very, very high PGE tenors in sulfide, and extreme nickel enrichment in the olivine. Some of the most nickel-rich olivines we've ever seen, up to about 14,000 ppm. This is the Shenhong Yang. Furthermore, if we take a look at these samples individually, so if the colors now represent individual samples, thin section scale variation, what we see is there's a lot of variation at very short range. And within that, within samples, we see this negative correlation between nickel and forsterite. So the more NGO poor, specifically the more iron rich the olivine, the more nickel rich it is. And now this is a really interesting clue to what's going on in these kinds of systems. So let's take a look at what we think might be happening. And the first thing to look at here is the effect of reaction of olivine that trapped into cumulus liquid as our cumulus solidifier. So now these deposits typically form in small intrusions. They're oxotypically orthocumulates. They're mixtures of olivine and interstitial liquid. And as that interstitial liquid crystallizes to form our intercumulus phases, the olivine reacts with that intercumulus liquid and shifts to become more iron rich, and typically just slightly more nickel depleted, but the nickel content doesn't change by very much. The main effect is to push these olivines towards lower forsterite contents. That's in the presence of only tiny amounts of sulfide or no sulfide at all. If we now go to a system where we've got sulfides present, then it gets a bit more interesting. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Now we've got a system where we have olivine, silicate melt, and sulfide liquid. If we've got more than about 4 or 5% sulfide liquid, then the sulfide is the dominant repository of nickel in the system. In other words, the sulfide liquid composition buffers the olivine, and that's a very important consequence. So what's going on now is the olivine reacts with the sulfide liquid and the trapped liquid. It's got to obey this exchange reaction. This is the exchange of olivine, the exchange of iron and nickel between the olivine and the sulfide. It's described by this exchange reaction, and that exchange reaction is mediated by this equilibrium constant, Kd. That's a constant number over most conditions. Doesn't seem to vary very much with temperature. So what happens now is our olivine reacts with the trapped liquid and becomes more iron rich. You see the sulfide is effectively self-buffering, so the sulfide composition doesn't change much. The iron content of the olivine goes up. So what happens to the nickel content of the olivine? Well, it has to go up as well in order to satisfy that equilibrium constant. So if the sulfide composition doesn't change, the olivine increases its nickel content. How big an effect is that? Reasonably large. So here's a couple of trapped liquid shift effects modeled on top of the data from the Savannah region. Forget the colors, these are the different individual intrusions. Just look at the overall spread of data. And what you'll see is that the effect of trapped liquid crystallization for a fairly typical sort of circumstance, that's 50% trapped liquid and electrolyte. The nickel content in the olivine can go up by about 500 ppm as the forsterite content goes down by about 5%. So it's a reasonably significant effect compared to the range that we see within individual deposits. Now, is that enough to explain this nickel enrichment that we see in several other mineralized intrusions? Well, perhaps it is. It certainly explains this nickel-iron correlation that we see within individual samples at Kevitsa. The more iron-rich the olivine, the more nickel-rich it is, exactly because of that coupled exchange effect during trapped liquid crystallization. So, but it can't explain this extreme enrichment. So we can get a few hundred ppm nickel enrichment out of this, but we can't go from 2,000 ppm to 12,000 ppm, which is where we need to get to to explain the Kavitsa data. So there's got to be something else going on. Furthermore, if we now break down the Savannah data set again, now I'm breaking it down into mineralized versus unmineralized samples. So right down to sample scale here, red samples have sulfide in them, blue samples don't. And what you can see is that some of the most nickel-enriched olivines are in samples with no sulfide in them. So the trapped liquid reaction effect can't explain this. We need another explanation. And here's a suggestion for what we think might be going on. And that is that this reaction of olivine with a sulfide, effectively sort of a sulfide buffer, happens at a larger scale, during recharge in a magma conduit. So this is a two-stage process. We start out with a relatively Mg-rich olivine. We make a relatively nickel-rich sulfide melt in our flow path. We now flush this system out with a more involved liquid, a more iron-rich olivine. This iron-rich olivine now reacts with that relatively nickel-rich sulfide. And again, because of this exchange equilibrium and this partition coefficient, the effect of that is to force the iron-rich olivine to become more nickel-rich. And we've done some calculations to simulate the Kavitsa olivines, and it turns out that it's still hard to get those extreme nickel enrichments, but it can be done. It's plausible to do it with this kind of mechanism in the right sort of circumstance. And in the case of Kavitsa, what seems to be happening is the magnets are actually reassimilating a komatiitic sulfide association, sulfide deposit. This then gives us a clue as to what might be going on more generally, where we're seeing nickel enrichment in intrusions in these kinds of systems. But that nickel enrichment is a result of olivine sulfide reaction during multi-stage ore forming processes, during this type of reactivation and backflow process, which I talked about in my paper in 2016 on nickel mineral systems. So wrapping all of that up, sulfide interactions can produce nickel enrichment as well as nickel depletion, sometimes in the same intrusion. That's strong nickel depletion. Strong nickel depletion is usually associated with low R factors, low tenor sulfides. Trapped liquid effects certainly play a role, but nickel enrichment is more likely to be due to multi-cycle reaction of olivine and sulfides in dynamic conduit systems. A nickel in olivine can be a useful exploration tool, but there's lots of potential false negatives. Shouldn't be used by itself, should always be used as part of a weighted evidence approach. Next development, now looking to see whether we can do the same thing with pyroxenes, which are often fresh in these kinds of systems. That's the DOI for the paper. It's online at American Mineralogist. Want to follow up on some of the detail of this work. That's a link to our magmatic sulfide research group website, so please pay us a visit. And thank you for listening.